Good morning.
Okay, now it's working.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Opportunities in Hemp specific focus on Ecuador. My name is Ceci Zach, and I am with Gateway Proven Strategies, which is a cannabis consulting firm focused on helping clients recognize the value proposition that cannabis can bring to light. Our clients are global governments, innovators, investors, as well as Fortune 500 companies who are looking to capitalize on the benefits of this plant from a top line, bottom line perspective. We help strategize the opportunity, operationalize businesses, and help clients understand where they fit into the supply chain and to create a business model to capitalize the opportunity. So it's with our great pleasure to be hosting this educational forum specific to Ecuador. The goal that we have today is to help you, our participants, whom are key stakeholders that are interested in cannabis, understand the potential demand that hemp can create and how to operationalize the opportunities. So knowing that there is legislative opportunities that are brewing in Ecuador, I have to apologize with the technical challenges that we're having with my sound. So thank you for bearing with us. To just reiterate, we pulled together a stellar panel of experts to help you understand your specific opportunities with hemp in Ecuador. And what we will, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, who is Eric Singular. He's currently the Managing Director of International Hemp, as well as the Director of Agricultural Content for GPS, and serves as the host of the Hoban Minute, a weekly podcast perspective on current events within the marketplace. He brings a unique perspective to the entire industrial hemp supply chain, and he has worked with farmers, regulators, attorneys, researchers, and small businesses that are leading the resurgence of this emerging agricultural commodity in the United States. With that, I turn it over to Eric.
Good morning, all. And before we go any further, is my sound working okay? Everybody can hear me okay? Excellent. And then for the person who is managing the slides, are those working as well? Right now I'm just seeing the opportunities in hemp slide. There we go. Excellent. Thank you, Deanna. Well, it's an absolute pleasure to be here today and to get this opportunity to talk about the all the potential for hemp in Ecuador. And what's certainly been a pleasure of mine getting into the hemp industry is getting to see how this agricultural commodity is fitting into different economies and different countries around the world, as it's very unique everywhere you look. And one of the things that I really want to stress today is that there are a lot of patterns and a lot of things that we've learned in the last couple of years here in the United States as it relates to industrial hemp and how industrial hemp has developed in North America. And as more and more countries start to legalize industrial hemp, and as it becomes a global commodity like we know that it will, there are going to be opportunities that are very unique to each specific country and each specific region around the world. And I think, to put it very simply, not every piece of the industrial hemp application is going to work everywhere. And countries really need to focus on what they already have dialed in as far as their large economic infrastructure, their processing infrastructure, and their overall core competencies. But before we get too far into my little piece of this, I just want to talk about a note on language very quickly, because there's going to be a lot of terms that we use to describe this plant, and they mean mostly the same thing because we're all talking about the same genus and the same species of plant. However, for many different reasons, we have different words for the same thing. So I know down in Latin America, cáñamo is the word that is used. Here in the United States, we really use the words hemp and marijuana. They both fall under the cannabis word. However, we use these words to delineate between THC. So for high THC varieties of cannabis, anything in the United States that is above 0.3% by dry weight, that is considered marijuana, and everything that is below 0.3% THC by dry weight we call hemp. And really, I think for this conversation, we're talking about the industrial uses of the cannabis plant, or the industrial uses of cáñamo. So with that being said, let's jump on into this. And the first thing that I want to talk about is coming back to this idea that there are so many uses and potential applications of the hemp plant. A couple years ago, the Congressional Research Service here in the United States commissioned a study to get a sense of just how big the economic impact of hemp could be. And a great researcher found that there are likely somewhere in the range of 20,000 to 25,000 different uses of industrial hemp. We've also heard estimations that go as high as 50,000 uses of hemp, but the point really is here that almost everything that can be made from petroleum, that can be made from different agricultural commodities, corn, wheat, soy, all of these things can be serviced with industrial hemp. And to really understand the uses of the hemp plant, I think it's useful to look at something like this that shows you all these potential avenues that you can go down. But I really want to take it maybe a step further and break this down a little bit. So as we see on the next slide, there are really 4 different components where all these maybe 25,000 uses of hemp derive from. And those are the, pop to the next slide, please. Those are seed, fiber, and flower. And we're going to get pretty nuanced here in the different avenues that derive from these. But at a high level, seed, we're really talking about grain. We're talking about protein. There are no cannabinoids really present in the seeds of industrial hemp. And for many years, hemp grain has been used as a protein, as a feed for livestock around the world, whether that's in the European Union or in Canada. We've also seen the development of hemp fiber, and the real leader in this category is going to be China. So most of the fiber applications of hemp we see have been developed in Asia, and particularly China, as it relates to woven textiles. And of course, the biggest market that has really made people excited, particularly here in the United States, and where the focus has been for, I would say, the last 6 years, really since hemp became legal, has been on the flower and the cannabinoids that can be extracted and derived from legal hemp. And those cannabinoids include CBD, they include minor cannabinoids like CBG and CBN, and there even is a little bit of THC that can be derived from industrial hemp. And when you think about Ecuador, where the threshold of THC was put at 1% THC, then there could be quite a bit of THC extracted from a hemp flower that is grown in Ecuador. It might not be as much as a marijuana or a high THC derived extract, but it could still be pretty substantial. And I would also add on that point that there is a pretty large market, for these oils, and particularly for higher THC allowance. I think it puts Ecuador at an advantage because you tend to see that varieties of hemp that have a higher inflorescence of THC also have a higher inflorescence of other cannabinoids. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in more detail. But if we go to the next slide, let's dig into this concept a little bit more, which is that there are really 4 types of hemp farming, and they all differ pretty greatly from each other. As we've kind of talked about, cannabinoids have been the main focus, and that style of production really looks horticultural. It's common for cannabinoid hemp to be grown in greenhouses, and you really are going for a plant that is not very tall, is extremely bushy, and has a lot of production of flower, because that's where you're going to get the majority of that concentrated cannabinoids, and that's where you're going to get the highest value from. Grain is kind of where my specialty lies and what I'll be talking about a lot today, because it does offer such a nutrient-dense protein. It's very similar in its production style to corn and wheat, and can make for a really wonderful crop to be used for diversification purposes. And a lot of the machinery, the agricultural knowledge, and the infrastructure that it takes to process hemp grain pretty much exists when you're looking at any country or any farm operation that is currently cultivating corn or wheat. It's pretty easy to adapt over to hemp for that purpose. And I think that makes it very advantageous, because as we look at fiber, which there's certainly a lot of interest in, fiber probably has been the biggest obstacle here in the United States. And that is really because the technology that is needed to extract those long and short fibers from the industrial hemp plant is very expensive, and very, up until this point, what we've seen is that it hasn't been easy to develop here in this country. And that's not to say that it might not be easier to develop in Ecuador. It's just to kind of make the point that more infrastructure is likely needed to really get to the fiber applications of the hemp plant. And there has certainly been an interest here in the United States, and it really comes from the example we've seen in Europe that's called dual cropping or tricropping. So that means growing one field of hemp to get all 4 of these different or 3 of these different verticals off of. And while that certainly is the goal and the long-term goal, it is very challenging. And I think the couple of videos I added in here after this slide, they kind of highlight why that is challenging to get these multiple purposes out of a single crop, especially when the industry and the development of genetics and varieties of hemp is still fairly nascent. So if we pop over to the next slide, I think we have a short little video here where we can just see what a field of hemp grain really looks like. And you're looking at something that pretty closely resembles any corn or wheat operation. You're looking at about plants planted on 7-inch rows, very high population density, and you really want to produce as much grain as possible on that land. So as you can kind of see in this little clip, this is a large acreage field that's being grown for certified seed production, which we'll talk a little bit more about certified seed and how it differs from the grain market and the potential and opportunities there. But this is just a good little view at what a grain field of hemp looks like. If we pop over to the next slide and the next little video, This is probably one of my favorite videos to showcase for what fiber hemp looks like and how it differs from growing hemp for grain. So this video comes from Patagonia, who sources the majority of their industrial hemp from China. And it gives you a great little sneak peek into what hemp fiber really looks like and what that production style, what it takes. So if you can tell from this video, and it's a little hard to because it's moving so quickly, but those plants are probably between 12 and 20 feet tall, whereas the plants we saw in the grain video were closer to about 10 to 12 feet tall. And that's very advantageous to have a taller plant that with a very skinny stalk when you're trying to get these yarn and cotton, cottonized fibers out of the hemp plant. And then if we go over to the next video, we'll see what a cannabinoid farm looks like. And more than likely, it's going to resemble what you might be used to seeing in a floriculture style production. So if you notice here, you have what essentially looks like Christmas trees. You have plants that are spaced very far apart, and you have a very different method of harvesting. They're not running a combine through there and cutting down the plants. They're going through and actually hand harvesting them. So for any production that you're doing for cannabinoids, it looks quite a bit different than what you would grow for grain and fiber. And that's really the point that I'm trying to make here, is just that while there are so many different applications and it is possible to get multiple uses out of a single crop, it's very important, especially at the beginning stages of something, to just dial in and standardize one vertical at a time. We've seen a lot of failure here in the United States as it relates to industrial hemp crop failure for a number of reasons. And we'll talk a little bit more about why that is and how that can be avoided in Ecuador. But really the point I'm trying to drive home here is just that there are multiple different uses of the crop, and there are very different production styles that can be used to get there. So if we pop over to the next slide. I want to look for a moment at just oversupply, because this has been a big component here in the United States, and I think it would be something really worth noting as the Ecuador industrial hemp industry comes online, to kind of avoid this and kind of take this as a cautionary tale, that there was so much excitement and so much focus put on the CBD part of the industry that we have just consistently seen the price of hemp biomass or hemp flower that would be used for extraction fall. And really all we're looking at here is just, what happens when your supply eclipses the demand. And this has been a big challenge because now many of the farmers who grew hemp for CBD have not been able to sell their material. They've had to store it, which is very costly. And it's just a good, I think, learning to take before we jump into hemp specific to Ecuador, that it's very important to kind of look at your market, look at what the opportunities are, but then balance that so that you don't recreate the situation that we saw here, which is that farmers were really left bearing a lot of this burden. People were very excited about hemp, and the conversations have changed so dramatically in the last couple of years, particularly when I speak with farmers here in the United States, because the crop that appeared to be so much better than, let's say, corn, wheat, or soy, when you have something like this happen, people get very discouraged. And when they hear the horror stories of people who grew this crop and took a risk and then didn't get weren't able to sell their crop, that leads to a huge issue, and then people don't want to grow anymore. So definitely something to think about as the Ecuador market develops. But now let's jump into kind of the true opportunities here of hemp in Ecuador. So we know a little bit about Ecuador's economy is very, very rooted in agriculture, industrial processing, and floriculture. And these are three industries that exist in Ecuador that are very, very robust. They already have a lot of the necessary infrastructure to easily include and fit industrial hemp into these pre-existing industries, which I just think is essential for any country that's coming online with hemp production. And we'll jump into agriculture specifically. So I went and looked at the USDA reports on kind of what the snapshot is for Ecuador's agricultural economy. And what really jumped out is that because of the growth that we've seen in the shrimp farming and aquaculture sector in Ecuador, there is a very, very necessary need to find cheaper solutions for livestock feed. And that's something that really hits home for me, because we know that hemp is a very, very effective, it's a cost-effective and very, very protein and nutrient effective feed for livestock. Unfortunately, here in the United States, we haven't really been able to explore that, but we know when we look at other markets like Canada and the European Union, where hemp grain has been an approved livestock feed for many years, that there's all kinds of benefits. And as you just look at this really quickly, corn consumption is down, wheat imports are up somewhat to meet that demand for livestock feed, and it seems like rice is increasingly being used for animal feed. And we'll talk a little bit more about, especially as we get to Ryan Douglas and talking about the farming side of hemp, what you should avoid as far as, when you look at crop diversification and growing hemp in conjunction with other crops, there are certain crops you want to avoid planting before and after with industrial hemp. But just looking at the grain market here in Ecuador, you see that rice has, almost consumed entirely domestically. It's an increasing grain commodity. Corn is falling pretty substantially, and wheat is majorly being imported from Canada and the United States. And this, I think, presents a real opportunity, because hemp grain, as we've talked about a little bit, is very, very high in protein. It's very nutrient dense, and it provides a great feed for livestock. And something worth noting here, because this is the issue we've seen in the United States, is there is a concern by regulators that maybe there is THC or other cannabinoids present in hemp grain. There is not, and it's very important to realize that hemp grain is almost entirely equatable to rice, corn, and wheat. There really is none of this need for fear around whether or not feeding livestock with hemp grain is going to lead to THC in the final end product. So if we go to the next slide, we can see from this graph just how much the shrimp production and trade has exploded. And clearly with this much production going on, it becomes very clear that a cheap feed solution is extremely necessary, because it is expensive to produce corn, it's expensive to produce wheat, especially when you're importing it from other countries. And so the need for a domestically produced cheap alternative is essential. And anecdotally, we've talked to a lot of folks here in the United States who are doing the research on hemp feed to try to determine just how effective hemp feed is as a solution. And what we're finding is that it is so nutrient dense that in general, livestock are consuming less of it and finishing and gaining weight more quickly with less food. And I think that really makes a compelling case for when you look at the economics of needing to, to finish these shrimp and get them to an ideal weight fairly quickly and fairly cheaply. I think hemp grain makes a lot of sense, particularly, in this economy. So if we jump to the next slide, we can look a little bit at just the different market factors here. As we see, one of the most important functions in the production of shrimp is to have that food supply, because you need the livestock to get to an optimal size prior to harvest, and you need to do it cheaply. So I really think that when you look at just that market snapshot of what we saw in March of 2020, it makes a pretty compelling case for introducing hemp grain, and particularly when you look at farmers in Ecuador who are already cultivating corn or cultivating wheat, who have experience growing traditional row crop agricultural commodities. Makes a lot of sense. And if we jump over one more slide, we'll look a little bit at the floriculture economy in Ecuador. We know that this is just a huge part of Ecuador's economy, and that the USA is a main importer. And while I think other panelists today will be able to talk a little bit more to the cannabinoid element of industrial hemp and the extraction element of industrial hemp, I really think that the experience that Ecuador farmers have, and that the industry in general has around roses, poinsettias, and chrysanthemums in Ecuador, is going to position it very well for cultivating high cannabinoid hemp. And because you already have a pre-existing industry there, you might be able to avoid some of the issues that we saw here in the United States. But that kind of brings me to my final point here, which is just the importance of genetics. This has been likely one of the biggest hurdles to the industry here in the United States. And really, I think you can't understate it. Ecuador and many Latin American countries sit at a very interesting latitudinal zone in the world. And many of the varieties of hemp that exist on these two seed certifying agencies lists were bred in the northern parts of the world, whether that's Canada or in the Northern European Union states, countries. So it's going to be very important to really trial and error and experiment with genetics in Ecuador. We're going to talk a lot more about this with Ryan Douglas, and when he really talks about the cultivation journey. But OECD seed schemes is an international seed certifying body. That's where a lot of the varieties that we see here in the United States that have been grown for grain and fiber and those real industrial uses, that's where those seeds came from. And AOSCA is the certifying body here in the United States. And I just think that this is going to be key to the growth of the industry in Ecuador. It was key to the growth of the industry here in the United States. And it really gets into the idea of standardization. You need to have a crop that you can rely on. And while there definitely will be some variability in how varieties that are known to perform well in the north perform in Ecuador, starting with these varieties, I think, is going to be essential. And the other thing I just want to note here is one of the leading researchers here in the United States, Dr. Larry Smart at Cornell University, recently published a study that showed that hemp genetics is much more a critical factor in cannabis that goes above the THC threshold that is considered legal than conditions. So when you think, maybe we're going to bring some of these varieties into Ecuador, and the environmental conditions of having a 12-hour light cycle or different weather patterns, weather events, different stresses that the plants are under, that might cause a plant to go hot. It's really important to note that more often than not, it's the genetics of the plant that are going to determine what a plant does, even under stress, and how much THC it produces.
Eric, thank you so much. And could you give me a thumbs up if you can hear me? Okay, great. Wonderful presentation, Eric. And we're going to hold question and answer until after Ryan's presentation. So without further ado, let me introduce Ryan Douglas, who helps new cannabis cultivators come to market quickly and spend less money getting there. With over 20 years of experience in commercial plant production, Ryan has helped new commercial cultivators skip the typical startup mistakes so they grab more market share, realize higher profits, and expand faster than the competition. Even before entering the cannabis industry, Ryan spent 15 years as a commercial greenhouse grower of ornamental and edible crops, cultivating and growing up to 600,000 plants annually. And as a master grower from 2013 to 2016, Ryan directed cultivation for Tweed Inc., which is Canada's largest licensed producer of cannabis and the flagship subsidiary of Canopy Growth Corporation. So with that, Ryan, we know that you've also spent the last 4 years in Colombia, which makes you truly the global expert for our participants today. So thank you very much. And Ryan, if you could help us with the video and say advanced slides, that would be great. Thank you.
Of course, my pleasure. Thank you for the introduction, Ceci. Good morning to everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with everyone this morning. I am a cultivation consultant and I specialize in helping startups in newly regulated states and countries with new cannabis programs. So the title of my talk today will be, we can advance the slide there. Is the agricultural journey. So I'll be talking specifically about the cultivation of hemp. So in my opinion, there's a real opportunity, a special opportunity in Ecuador with regards to hemp cultivation. So I've spent the last 4 years living and cultivating and consulting on cultivation projects, cannabis cultivation projects in Colombia. And in 2016, it was a very promising program in Colombia. For a number of reasons, I don't think it's been as smooth as a lot of people hoped. And the details of that, really, it's not the point of this presentation. But from my perspective, I think that depending on how the legislation in Ecuador plays out, that Ecuador really has a real chance of not only catching up to where Colombia is today, but surpassing it in terms of the success of their program and the benefit to their economy. So the opportunity here really is to learn from Colombia, because it's been legal there for 4 years. It's a neighboring country, and there's a lot of similarities between Colombia and Ecuador. But also the idea is to help avoid the common startup mistakes, which I have found happen time and time again, regardless of what state or country new companies are starting up cannabis programs. So move along to the next slide. And so just kind of a brief summary. In Colombia, over the last few years, the focus has really been on flower production. So either for THC or CBD, what they would call psychoactive or non-psychoactive, and then the production of seed for planting. So the difference is here in Ecuador, I believe there'll be some focus on CBD production because it's a natural byproduct of hemp, but there'll be a much more of a focus on hemp production for fiber and seed production for grain, much like Eric had specified in his presentation. So moving on to the next slide. So immediately, right away, we'll notice there's a structural difference between cannabis that's typically grown for flower production or seed production and cannabis that's grown for fiber. So it almost looks like an entirely different plant when we look at the picture on the right-hand side, industrial hemp. So it actually more closely resembles bamboo, or what in Colombia they call guadua, because it's very tall, very lanky, and it's grown at a high density. So actually that high density forces the plant to grow tall, thus creating more fiber. But visually, there's quite a stark difference between cannabis grown for flower and cannabis grown for fiber. Next slide. So fortunately, the good news is that cannabis can be a seamless replacement for other crops. So in this photograph here, we're comparing really a cornfield to a hemp field, and it's practically identical. So over the last few years in Colombia, I've worked with clients that have been really looking to replace existing crops with something much more profitable, right? That's the whole reason, that's the name of the game. So I've worked with companies that are replacing coffee crops, they're replacing sugarcane, they're replacing rice with cannabis. And not every instance is appropriate, but the majority of crops can be replaced with cannabis. Next slide. And so that also goes for indoor. So these photographs are from a cut flower greenhouse in Colombia, just outside of Medellin. So on the left, they're growing chrysanthemums, and on the right, they're growing cannabis inside the exact same facility, practically the exact same inputs, the same labor. It's almost a seamless replacement, which is good news. Next slide. So as with most crops, location is everything. Fortunately, cannabis is a warm weather crop, and Ecuador is a pretty warm place. So generally speaking, cannabis does best when the temperature ranges are between 20 and 30 degrees Celsius, which is roughly 68 Fahrenheit to about 85 Fahrenheit. So of course, the plant can grow outside of that range. But what we find is that when the temperatures are chronically below that range or consistently above that range, the plants are more susceptible to disease and insect infestations and may have nutrient problems. So, so that's 20 to 30 degrees is really the ideal. Outside of that is fine, but when we talk about consistently outside of that range, that's where we can get into problems. And it almost makes more sense to look for a different location than trying to make less than optimum locations work. So sunlight, typically a minimum of 6 hours direct sunlight. Humidity comes into play if we're growing cannabis for flower production. A little bit less important when we're talking about seed production and fiber production, but generally 40 to 70%. Higher than that, there's an increased chance that the crop will be attacked by mold. And if it's consistently lower than that, there's actually some insects that thrive on dry weather, and you would have a much harder time keeping them off of your crop. Adequate water supply, especially during the first few weeks of the crop cycle as the seedlings are really taking root and reaching out into the ground. You really don't want to rely on rain. You really want to have a way to irrigate the entire field, the entire crop, especially during the first portion of the crop. And in terms of neighboring farms, the risk is if you're growing cannabis for flower production, neighboring farms that have hemp growing could accidentally pollinate your crop. And so what happens is if you're growing a cannabis crop for flower production, the idea is not to pollinate it, so the plant continues growing flowers and continues trying to expose itself to pollination. Once a plant becomes pollinated, it changes the physiology of the plant. So it stops flower production and begins seed production. If you're growing seeds, not a problem. If you're trying to grow flowers, it seriously diminishes the harvest. So what can you do? Typically, the rule of thumb is roughly 20 kilometers between your crop and the next hemp crop. So of course, pollen can travel on wind gusts much larger than that, much longer distance than that. But once you get past 10, 15 kilometers, the chance of pollination decreases substantially. So one way to protect your cultivation is to kind of ensure a buffer of 20 kilometers around your farm that there's no other hemp or cannabis farms. So how do you do that? Perhaps one way is through the legislation. If there's some way of controlling where these licenses are issued, then you can control how much distance is between farm plots. Another way is to do aerial inspection. You could rent a helicopter for an hour, or more realistically, you could equip a drone with cameras and do flight surveillance around a 20 kilometer radius from where your farm is, looking for other large hemp cultivations or illicit crops as well. Next slide. So in terms of soil requirements, fortunately, cannabis or hemp does not require anything special that other large commercial agricultural crops require. So I mentioned before, it's a seamless replacement for other crops. So the soil doesn't need anything that a corn plantation or a tomato farm would need. So basically, you're looking for soil that's pretty rich with good drainage. So when we talk about farming outdoors, there's a certain range for each nutrient that the plant requires. So we talk about nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and in the soil, there should be a certain range and amount of that nutrient. And so what we do is we take a soil sample prior to planting, we determine what the soil has, and then we base that against the optimum range. So if it's deficient, then we incorporate fertilizer or we amend the soil, and then it's fine to plant. So if you're replacing another crop, likely the soil is fine because it's been cultivated for years, potentially decades. If you're looking to start cultivation on land that has never been planted before, we need to do a really careful analysis of not only the nutritional content of the soil, but also the structure itself. So if you look at the diagram on the left-hand side, soil particle size, this is kind of a comparison of what makes up soil. So you've got 3 different sizes of sand, right? Coarse sand, medium sand, fine sand. And so sand really essentially are miniature rocks. So you can imagine a lot of rocks together, water is going to pour through really quickly. It's not going to retain very well at all. So that's what we talk about when we talk about drainage. On the flip side, on the extreme side, we have particle sizes called silt and clay. Whereas sand is more circular like a rock, silt and clay is more like a disc, and they sit flat together. And what that does is not allow water to pass through. So you really want to avoid those 2 extremes, and the ideal soil for cultivating cannabis is going to be something that drains well, but holds a little bit of moisture. So in my experience in Colombia, groups that were intending to replace rice with cannabis did not have very much luck because, as you've likely seen, rice farmers flood their crops as a method of weed control, right? That's why rice paddies are full of water. So they're doing that to drown the weeds, but not the rice. And so as a result, in these areas where people are cultivating rice, it's very muddy. There's a lot of clay. And so there's not very much oxygen for plants to live, which is the purpose. They're trying to kill everything except the rice. So in my experience, it's very difficult to remediate that soil, amend that soil so it's appropriate for cannabis cultivation. So replacing sugarcane, replacing plantains or banana plantations, replacing coffee makes sense. Replacing rice, I would stay away from that and look for other land. Next slide, please. So planting density per acre. Again, we've got kind of the 2 extremes here. Fiber production can be upwards of 1 million seeds per hectare, and flower production can be as low as 5,000. So the reason is, as I mentioned before, anytime you plant a crop, any kind of plant at a very high density, it forces the plant to grow vertically, to stretch for light, because there's no space to grow horizontally. The only option is to grow up. So when we're growing things like industrial hemp, it actually works in our favor. A very high density planting is going to force those plants to grow tall and produce more fiber. Now on the flip side, with flower production, we really want to give these plants as much space as possible because things like airflow and light penetration are critical to really good flower production. So in seed production, if you're going for seed production, it kind of falls somewhere in the middle. But these are 2 extreme examples of, even though it's the same plant family, depending on the reason we're growing that crop, how it's spaced in the field can be very different. Next slide. So it's pretty common to start from seed, especially when we think about the high density planting of industrial hemp. Direct seeding into the field makes the most sense. Another option is actually starting the seed in some kind of protected structure and then transplanting outdoors. So it's certainly feasible when you're growing cannabis for flower, still feasible if we're growing cannabis for seed production, but transplanting 1 million industrial seed seedlings per hectare is probably unrealistic and not too efficient. But it's certainly an option, and this is a very common way of starting all kinds of agricultural crops. Seeding in a protected environment and then transplanting outdoors, either by hand or with a tractor implement. Next slide. So cloning or asexual propagation is probably the most common way to propagate plants in the US and Canada. And so the reason is, and so this is again much more particular for cannabinoid production if we're growing cannabis for flowers. So most hemp programs have a cutoff of THC content. And so it's pretty tricky to find varieties that perform well in your area, that have a very low THC content, but a very high CBD content or other cannabinoid content that is desirable. So once a company identifies a variety that performs well and tests under the limits or tests within the limits, they want to reproduce this as much as possible. So seeds are very unstable. So if you're broadcasting 100 or 1,000 seeds, you could come up with hundreds of different kinds of plants with different cannabinoid content. It's very difficult to grow a compliant crop that way. Cloning is an option for growing a compliant crop. Once you've identified a variety that works, essentially you grow out these large stock plants or mother plants, and then we take these small shoots, just a couple inches long, and root them. And then it's a method of having hundreds or thousands of genetically identical seedlings to plant outdoors. So there's probably two big risks with this method. It's not perfect. One risk is that if the stock plants or the mother plants become infected with a disease or an insect, it's very likely that the resulting seedlings and that crop will be infected with that same pathogen. So these stock plants typically stay months, sometimes years in these production facilities. And in my experience, the longer a plant stays in a production facility, the more likely it is to catch something. So the risk is that if we've identified ideal genetics, something that works for us, and then the stock plants become diseased, it can literally bring production to a halt because we can't continue propagating sick plants. So there's one risk. The other risk is that not every cultivator is skilled at rooting, at asexually propagating plants, rooting clones. So typically growers expect about 90% of the clones that they cut will root and can go into production. But I've worked with companies in Colombia where they're struggling to get 40 or 50%. So you've got a risk of disease and you've got a risk of inconsistency in terms of the cultivations team's capacity to successfully root these. So one solution to that is micropropagation or tissue culture. So again, this is a little bit more comprehensive, a little bit more involved, but is an option when we identify a variety that works really well and we need to produce thousands, sometimes millions of genetically identical seedlings on a production schedule of one certain variety. And so it's similar to cloning in that what we're doing is taking very small pieces of a plant and forcing it to grow into a new plant. So the difference is where with traditional cloning, you need a clone of a couple inches. Here we can produce brand new plants using literally just a few cells. So instead of harvesting 100 clones from a plant, we could harvest 10,000. And this entire process happens in a lab. So what we end up with at the end of the process are disease-certified free cuttings. And so they can be produced consistently. And every time you start a crop, and we'll talk about disease problems in here in just a second, but it's one way of fighting the battle against insects and disease is to start every crop with a certified disease-free cutting. So a couple options on how farmers can get started. Next slide. So here's the biggest challenge that hemp growers are going to face in Ecuador, and that is photoperiodism. So cannabis is a photoperiodic plant, which means that it initiates flowering when it experiences long nights. So it's a little bit rare in the horticultural world. Poinsettias are photoperiodic, chrysanthemums are photoperiodic, and cannabis is. So the challenge is, as Eric mentioned, most of the industrial hemp that's been grown up until now has been in North America, Canada, Europe, and China. So these are places that experience seasonal fluctuations. So the summer is really long, the days are really long, and the nights are really short. So the plants have a chance to grow vegetatively. That means they increase in size, they grow a lot of leaves and branches, they really fill out, and they really prepare themselves to withstand the weight of the flowers that will be coming soon. So they grow when the days are long and the nights are short. But as the fall approaches, the days get shorter and the nights get longer, and this triggers the plant to start flowering. So the problem in Ecuador is the same problem we've had in Colombia because we're right next door, is that every day and every night it's 12 hours. So more or less at 6 in the morning, the sun comes up, and 6 in the evening, the sun goes down. So the problem is for hemp farmers, if you direct seed into the field or you plant rooted cuttings into the field, the plant is going to start flowering once that seed emerges from the soil, or once that clone really kind of gets establishes and reaches out into the soil, because they're being exposed to long nights immediately. And so the risk is that the plant will grow and begin flowering and will finish flowering, and the plant's going to be really small. So it's going to dramatically affect the harvest. So this picture here in the center is a greenhouse in Colombia. And so we've got two options, really. We've got two options when we're growing cannabis close to the equator. One is to lengthen the day. So if the sun comes up at 6 and it sets at 6, we use artificial lights that kick on at 6 in the evening, and they run for a couple hours. So we're artificially extending the day. So the plant has a really long day of growing and then a relatively short night, so it stays in vegetative growth. The other option is to interrupt the night. Instead of expanding the light cycle during the day, the sun comes up at 6, it sets at 6. And then around 10 o'clock at night, we turn on these lights for about 15 minutes. And then about 2 o'clock in the morning, we turn on the lights for 15 minutes. And then at 6 o'clock in the morning, the sun comes up again. So what we're doing is what's called flower interruption. We're interrupting those long nights, kind of shocking the plant, waking the plant up to prevent it from flowering. So one more option is to utilize auto-flowering strains. So these are varieties of cannabis that flower regardless of day length. It's more related to time. So roughly 6 or 8 weeks after the seed germinates, it begins to flower, whether the days are 20 hours long or 8 hours long. So the only problem is that most auto-flowering varieties are really small. If you look at that picture on the right-hand side, that's a completely mature auto-flowering plant that maybe is 12 or 15 inches tall, right? And we really want to grow plants that finish around 2 meters. So a number of different challenges when it comes to photoperiodic plants when you're growing them in a place like Ecuador. Next slide. So in terms of plant biology, most cannabis plants are either male or female. Some breeders are creating cannabis plants that are both male and female on the same plant, and that's typically for seed production or fiber production, so that they actually want a lot of pollination within the crop, so that the chance of pollination increases when you've got every single plant is both male and female. But for the most part, you've got male plants and female plants. Next slide. So pest and disease, this is certainly a challenging issue. Now that we have globally more and more large hemp and cannabis cultivations, what we're finding is that there's more and more diseases to combat. And in my experience, I've grown in the US and Canada, and in Colombia, there's just much more to compete with. And so I think part of that is because in the northern regions, you have winter, which kills off plants, it kills off insects, or it forces things to go dormant. And then in the spring, everyone's kind of on this even footing and everything starts back up again. But in places like Ecuador and Colombia, there's never winter, right? It's just the growing season always, and it always has been. So in my opinion, there's more diseases to handle, and there's actually more insects as well. So what do we do? As with anything, really, preventative measures are much more efficient than curative measures. So even prior to planting the crop, I would recommend a company has a relationship with a beneficial insect supplier. So this is someone that provides predatory insects that are used to keep damaging insects in check. I would also have an agronomist or an agricultural specialist establish what's called an integrated pest management program. And that's simply a way of keeping pests in control by combining beneficial insects with pesticides, with cultural practices. And the final step, I would say, is to align yourself with a lab that can test for plant diseases. So if you look at the picture on the right-hand side, this is obviously a plant that has been attacked by a disease, but like most growers, at first glance, I don't know what it is, right? We can speculate, but we really want to make sure we know what that is so we can at least try to salvage or prevent the remainder of that crop from getting affected, and certainly prevent it on the next crop. And so in my experience, agricultural universities typically have labs, and they offer that service where you send them a piece of plant tissue or a plant sample, and they come back and tell you exactly what that disease is. And then we start the process of preventing it from infecting the next crop. But anyone that has agricultural experience in Ecuador, this is not news, right? I mean, this is the battle for farmers everywhere, and it always has been, insects and disease. So it's nothing new, but it's certainly going to be challenging in terms of cannabis production in Ecuador. Next slide, please. So the crop cycle roughly is 4 months. Fiber can be a 2 to 3 month crop cycle. If you're growing for seed or flower, that's much closer to 4 months. Yields, so these are all over the map, right? I typically tend to use conservative numbers when I'm helping companies develop production plans or business plans. So these numbers are pretty rough. And the seed production should be 2,000 to 2,500 pounds per hectare, or a little bit more. That was a typo on my end, but just some ballpark figures of what we can expect in terms of yield per hectare. Next slide, please. Great, so harvesting, another critical step to the hemp cultivation process. So as Eric had mentioned, there's basically 2 different kinds of material that we're harvesting from the hemp plant. So one is the bast fiber, which is more on the outside of the plant, outside of the stalk, and the hurd, which is more the woody material that's in the center of the stalk. The green microfiber is really what's left from the flower once we harvest the seeds. So if you look at this picture in the center here, the process of separating this material is called decortication. So it can be done wet, it can be done dried. There's actually a process of doing it called redding, which is actually a process of decomposition where the material is harvested, it's left on the ground for 4 or 5 weeks. And if the moisture is right and the temperature is right, the natural decomposition process actually begins to separate the material of the stalk, and it makes it much easier to separate the fiber from the hurd. But again, it's dependent on temperature and humidity. And we as commercial cultivators really need to standardize the process. So regardless of the season and regardless of the temperature of the weather, we really need to have a standardized harvesting and processing process, especially when we're talking about really big farms. So my recommendation is to harvest the material and process it wet. So in this picture, we've got a pretty big tractor that's doing the harvesting. Now I know from my experience in the US and Canada, most farms are pretty flat, but in Colombia, most farms are on a mountaintop. So there's no, mechanization is not an option. So whether we harvest by hand and bring it to the processing facility, or we harvest using mechanization and bring that to the processing facility, what we really want to do is invest in some technology that allows us to process that material wet. And what it does is separate the bast fiber from the hurd, from the seeds, and from the green microfiber or the flowers. And that's really the most efficient way to do it. It's ideal. And so this equipment is available in the US and Canada. Pricing is kind of a moving target because even though the companies are based out of the US or Canada, oftentimes the equipment is being shipped from China. And of course they have a number of different models and sizes, but with any kind of modern agricultural equipment, this kind of technology, we need to anticipate paying a couple $100,000 for this equipment, which is pretty standard pricing. Next slide. So harvesting for flower, it's a little bit different. So we've basically got 2 different ways to dry cannabis when we grow it for flower. One is to hang the plant and air dry it, much like you would tobacco leaves. So within about 7 or 10 days inside of a climate-controlled environment, the product will dry sufficiently. There's also more mechanized drying machines, which are essentially ovens, and it moves the product inside of this piece of equipment, and we can dry large volumes of product within an hour or 2. Next slide. And harvesting for seed, this is going to resemble really any other kind of grain that we harvest. So we harvest the plant, and then there's a process of separating the seeds from the plant. There's likely a very short period of drying, So the temperature is not too high because we don't want to cook the seeds, but it's just part of the natural process. And then storage is important. So if it's stored for a short period of time, it's not too critical. If we're storing it for a long period of time, it's absolutely critical. So the moisture content inside of the seed is probably somewhere around 12 to 15%. So we want to keep the air just slightly above that. But the risk in really humid environments is that the seeds could start to germinate inside of those bags. And temperature is also an important consideration if we're talking about long-term storage, because there are insects that will attack grain. And so the lower the temperature, the less likelihood of their activity. So if we can keep storage rooms around 6 to 8 degrees Celsius, which is about 40, 45 degrees Fahrenheit, that would be ideal. And the next slide, I think we're wrapping up here. So in my opinion, Ecuador really has the opportunity to be the new frontier for hemp. So if you think about some of the challenges I just talked about today, in terms of genetics, in terms of finding something that works well in Ecuador, looking ahead to the next few years, you've got all of these countries that are along the equator, and even countries slightly above it and slightly below it that will be legalizing cannabis. And they'll be in exactly the same position that Ecuador is today. And that is, they're going to be looking for genetics that work. So over the last year, I've received calls from companies in Sri Lanka and Thailand, and they're all asking me the same thing. Where can we find seed in volume for high CBD, low THC cannabis plants? And it's not an easy answer because no one's really producing this en masse. So it's not going to be easy, but Ecuador really has the opportunity to identify, to create these genetics and the protocols and the processing protocols and really export this IP around the world. So this is going to be in demand for the next several years, and it's going to be in high demand. So I think Ecuador really has the chance over the next few years to position themselves globally as one of the leaders in equatorial hemp production. So thanks so much for your time, guys. That's almost exactly 30 minutes. It's been my pleasure, and I look forward to answering any questions you may have. Thank you.
Ryan, thank you very much. And if you could all just mention, maybe give a thumbs up that you can hear me, that would be great. Fantastic. Ryan, that was wonderful. And this is a point in time where I'm also going to ask Eric to come back, as we've received a few questions in the Q&A in the chat session. And Eric, I'm actually going to start with a question for you. And one of the things that you didn't have a chance to review, but I think would be important to leave the participants on, is talking a little bit about some of the benefits that companies may receive from investing in hemp as an agriculture, whether it's around carbon credits, also the effect it may have in the soil using hemp and removing toxins. Can you just give us a brief overview of some of those benefits that you may see?
Sure. Yeah, and I'll take a stab at it, and then I'll probably let Ryan will as well. But one of the things that I saw when kind of looking and researching the opportunities in Ecuador is that, and this is true across the board for industrial agriculture, is that it's very taxing on soil. It tends to, whether it's having to use a lot of pesticides and herbicides for floricultural production, or just monocropping, so growing the same crop year over year, tends to really exhaust the soil. And one of the things that we've definitely seen with industrial hemp, one of the things that's being studied a lot here in the United States is the potential for soil remediation with industrial hemp. So using hemp as a method of crop diversification to put nutrients back into the soil. And there's also a component there of carbon credits, and the fact that hemp captures quite a bit of carbon as it grows. That's a very necessary, essential element that is needed for hemp production. And really, as we see the industry develop and international standards develop around just putting quantitative analysis behind what hemp is capable of, there are going to be environmental probably benefits, and I would say government-backed incentive programs for the production of industrial hemp. The other thing we have seen and a study that I'm very interested in here in the United States is planting hemp near polluted waterways and using it as a form of water reclamation, just because it does have a tendency to absorb a lot of things in the soil. But one note I will say is that whenever you're growing hemp, particularly for the extraction or cannabinoid process, you have to be careful about heavy metals in the soil and really getting a good sample analysis and a soil test to make sure that there are not heavy metals in the soil, because hemp does have a propensity to absorb those. And then when they are extracted, when the cannabinoid-rich oil is extracted from the hemp, those heavy metals are also extracted. And when you do tests to determine what is in the oil, if it's found that you have heavy metals in there, you basically have a product that you can't market.
So I'll just add to that. I totally agree with what Eric has said. I have less experience with soil remediation and hemp, more academic experience, so I read about it. But he brought up a good point in terms of monoculture being taxing on the soil. So one benefit of cannabis, because it can seamlessly integrate into an existing agricultural program already, is that it can be part of a crop rotation. So if someone is interested in trying hemp, they don't have to necessarily throw out everything they were growing before, because we're talking about a 3 or 4 month crop. It can be one of several different crops that are grown on a plot of land and rotated in order to improve the nutrition of the soil. So it can provide, it can be an important cover crop as part of a rotation on the farm.
Thank you, gentlemen. Next question is around the price of the cost and growing per hectare within grain per hectare for the grain. So what is the cost production for each type per hectare? Can either one of you comment on that?
Oh, yeah, I'll speak to it very quickly. So I see one of the questions here being, is hemp more beneficial from a water consumption standpoint? So when you look at just the inputs needed to grow hemp, first, there's going to be the price of seed or clones. Both of those are going to be a higher price point, especially because you're importing those into the country. And I can tell you from the conversations that we've had at the company I work for, which is a certified seed provider, the price of importing seed or just sending seed from the United States to any country in Latin America is very expensive right now. So there is going to be some cost as it relates to that input. The thing I will say about water consumption or other costs associated is yield is going to be impacted by water and fertilizer and all of those traditional agricultural inputs. So you can absolutely grow hemp without irrigating, depending on your precipitation and the amount of moisture and everything. However, for really high yields, you're going to need to put some input into the crop. And it depends entirely on whether or not you need to irrigate. So if you need to irrigate for corn or wheat, you would likely need to irrigate for industrial hemp, but I'll let Ryan answer as well.
Yeah, so you've got a lot of variables in there. Probably the best way to estimate cost would be to determine, if we're talking about someplace specific in Ecuador, determine what the cost of production for an hectare of any other crop is. And then the biggest difference, the processing end, I really can't speak to, the pricing on that. But the difference between growing, we'll say tomatoes or corn or sugarcane, the difference is going to be just like Eric said in the seed. So you've got places in the US that are charging $1 per seed. So hopefully when we're talking about industrial fiber, we can get that price much, much lower, but maybe we're talking 10 cents US per seed or 20 cents US per seed. So that's going to be the biggest differentiator, but it's really tricky to estimate. I mean, that's part of the work that I do is help people with their business plans and their production planning, but we need to look at probably 12 different variables to come up with a realistic number.
Thank you. And we have time for one more question. And this one I will direct to Ryan. And that, can you talk a little bit about pesticides and the use within hemp? The question was actually, are there specific pesticides for hemp? But maybe you could comment on how to prevent infestations and pesticide use.
Sure. So in the US, we have a list of pesticides that are permitted for use on hemp. When we look at Ecuador, likely there'll be chemical pesticides that will be permitted for use on industrial hemp that's grown for fiber. So it wouldn't be any different than a cotton field, for example, because that material is used for making clothes. So no one's going to be consuming that product. But when we talk about cannabis that's grown for flower consumption, or for extraction of the cannabinoids, or for seed consumption, then you should anticipate some pretty strict regulations around pesticide use. So there will likely be pesticides that you can use, but they're going to be organic in nature, or organic based. So really the ideal situation is to establish a beneficial insect program. So you're not spraying for insects. We're using predatory insects to attack the damaging insects. And then using a bio or an organic-based fungicide to battle the disease issues.
Fantastic. Thank you both, Ryan and Eric. It was wonderful to get an overview of the value proposition hemp can bring to Ecuador and focusing on specific markets that are already existing within the country. And Ryan, wonderful presentation as it relates to the farming side and the specifics. So we're going to move now into another very important topic around compliance. We've talked about the value, we've talked about farming, and now Rafael Sabbagh from MJ Freeway, which was recently purchased by Akerna, is going to address some of the ancillary issues that we need to consider when we get into the hemp space. And just to give you a brief background on Rafael, he's an account executive for Akerna, a cannabis compliance company that has served as a government contractor in various marquee cannabis markets, focusing on implementing and maintaining state-level seed-to-sale tracking systems, as well as helping develop best practices for cannabis regulators. Rafael also has years of experience in working with cannabis businesses, both large and small, and implementing the best business tools for compliance and commerce. So with that, Rafael, take it away.
Thank you, Ceci. Thanks for the warm introduction. I hope to be as interesting as Eric and Ryan have been, but that is a tall order. So thanks to them early on. I will keep my part quick, just in about 15 minutes, kind of cover the landscape, at least what you can expect. And it might shake out a little differently in Ecuador, but this is a lot of lessons learned throughout the United States and some international markets. So just really quick by way of overview of the Akerna company and brand. We've been around since 2009. MJ Freeway has the first software company of its kind, focusing on being an ERP system for cannabis, really. So seed to sale tracking, but also business management. In 2017, we launched version 2 of our software, which is a true ERP system that I'll touch on here. But some interesting notes there, just specifying that we're the only software company in the space with already a version 2 of the platform. So a lot of lessons learned there, coming from $17 billion worth of transactions that have gone through our systems, as well as over 175 communal years between our staff of experience. So with that, that's a little overview on us. If you don't mind, Deanna, if you can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So with this slide, what I'd like to do is just give a very high-level intro into the compliance software you guys can expect to deal with in the space. So this does reflect the landscape in the United States and also internationally, some in the Caribbean, some in Europe. But for the most part, what you're going to be able to expect is once the market opens up, the regulatory body is going to require some form of tracking of the product from seed to sale. So with that, the regulatory body in place may also establish their own track and trace system. So that is differentiated from a seed to sale system. What a track and trace system does is it provides just a central database that all the businesses must report to. So a couple of the most popular models that we've seen is a decentralized model in which the state will just require all the businesses to have their own seed to sale tracking system, being the commercial business system that the operator is going to use to track everything in a business, and I'll explain a little bit more about that. And in this decentralized model, the regulatory body will not have a kind of a government tracking system that every company is to report into in real time. So it's as the name implies, it's very flexible, and it allows every business to operate kind of how they see best fit, as long as they're providing the, what, be it weekly or monthly or quarterly reporting to the state. In the United States, the most common model that we're seeing is a distributed model, which is essentially the regulatory body will have a tracking system, a track and trace database that requires us or the operators to report everything they're doing in real time via an API. However, in this setup, they'll still allow the businesses to use their own commercial software as long as it does integrate with that state database via the API mentioned. So there it still gives, it's a hybrid approach where you have flexibility in reporting there. But with that, the final model, and we can go to the next slide if you like, the final model there is a centralized model, which is the regulatory body providing not just the state level tracking system, but also the commercial platform that the regulator must use. So what that all means is the states may set up a database that they want to passively receive information about your operation on, but you will still be required, whether by regulation or just by practicality, to use what is called a seed to sale tracking system in some way or form. So the seed to sale tracking system is really the ERP system in our industry. So it's, whether equating it to Salesforce or an Oracle in the broad market, those players, at least not yet, aren't really operating in this space. So companies like MJ Freeway have emerged to provide that enterprise resource planning system in which you'll be able to manage your whole operation and still be reporting the data points you need to the state throughout. So what do those systems do for you? They'll do 6 main components that you should focus on. So the first three are on this slide. So the simplest is product lifecycle tracking, So pretty much just being able to manage and track the product and the production throughout each life cycle. So when it goes from seed to being propagated into a growing plant, even as it's going through the plant life cycle, having a system where you can be reporting the different nutrient feedings and the different just plant husbandry activities that you'll be taking care of, all the way through harvest, and then even after harvest through the different processing workflows. So just managing the product throughout its life cycle. Furthermore, for quantity and location tracking, that's really where it boils down to in compliance, and what they're trying to do, what the systems are going to do there for you is manage chain of custody. So who touched it last, where did it go, if it left your organization, as in a sale being sold to another organization, down to the agents in each organization that have sold and purchased the product. So there you have the life cycle, location tracking with quantities, and chain of custody. So those are going to be kind of the main things for compliance. And if we hop into the next slide, we'll see a few more of the more detailed and nuanced elements that these systems will do for you. So product origin traceability, that's really one of the hallmarks in seed to sale tracking, where in a nutshell, you can get an end product. Even if I'm not sure if Ecuador is going to allow export at the end of the day, but the point with these systems and the way these databases are structured is that even if it is being sold and going out of your market, using systems like MJ Freeway, the very, very end product, whether it's for industrial or for just human consumption, can be tracked back all the way to the seed where that the plant was included in a harvest batch of. Product workflow control, that's going to be critical, especially when it gets into processing. As you can see in this image here, processing can be pretty complex, as I'm sure most folks on this call have experience with. So with that, you're going to want this ERP system to not just allow you to have the appropriate fields for data tracking and analytics, but also actual workflow controls to make sure that your line staff and your employees that are interacting with the product may not inadvertently do something they're not supposed to, or go against the workflows that you guys have set in place. And ultimately, data management. No true ERP system would be complete without a back end of analytics and intelligence. And MG Freeway definitely does, but seed to sale software is worth their salt. We'll always include that in the back end. So as you're going through your workflows, making sure you're tracking everything, making sure everything's being done by the books in the back end, you'll be collecting a lot of useful information, like the costs that are going into your harvest and your processing, like the different breakdowns of demographics as to your purchasing and sales, down to which strains perform best. So a lot of useful information there. But I'd be remiss if I didn't mention on my very last slide here with the few minutes I have left. Deanna, if you don't mind going to the last slide, please. Thank you. The ecosystem would not be complete with only the compliance and the supply chain aspects. Definitely the business intelligence is crucial, but just as you probably experienced with other ERP systems in the broad market, there has emerged an ecosystem of what we refer to ancillary tools or plugins if we're using kind of the standard ERP parlance. So there is an ecosystem now of many vendors who provide things from QMS and GMP management, digital management of that, down to the Internet of Things with environmental controls that'll help you manage different elements and machinery that you use, whether it's in a grow house or in an indoor facility. And then even tools as far as e-commerce, where you may be used to using very generic and readily available e-commerce or digital marketing or even online payment tools that are simply not available in this space, as most players are still not too comfortable servicing the hemp and the cannabis and the marijuana industries. So with that, it's crucial to keep those things in mind, as those will be elements that you'll need to run your business, just like any broad market industry. So there's definitely a wealth of softwares that have emerged and platforms that have emerged to provide those needs, but it's something you need to be aware of, that for the most part, the readily available platforms and tools that you may have become accustomed to will not be available in this space. So that is a very, very high level overview. We could have an entire webinar in just the tech space. I definitely appreciate everybody's time and kind of breezing through this. If there's any questions, feel free to use this information that's here. But of course, we are going to have a Q&A at the end with Mr. Hoban, and we'll be happy to answer any questions that remain there. Ceci, Deanna, that's my spiel.
Rafael, thank you so much. One question that I have, could you just help the participants recognize what a typical onboarding would be for, working with, since we were focused on the farmers, what would onboarding, if you could spend a minute or two just helping us understand how your company would come in and onboard in order to create the compliance and the track and trace?
Definitely, that's a great question. Thank you. So we have, as you would imagine, a full onboarding team that dedicate themselves to that. And I guess the most standard experience is very, very early on in the process, or the very first thing we're going to do is work with your, at the end of the day, your management that's kind of setting up your workflows so that we can configure those workflows into our platform. So what does that really mean is our platform will allow you to kind of have your default workflow for how you may go through a processing, right, and assembling a final product. So with that, we'll work with you to configure those workflows in the system so that you can, as an operator, simply say, okay, right now I'm running my hemp fibers through the extractor or through this process, and in the back end, the system's already kind of pulling the different data elements. So what we'll do is we'll work with your management team upfront to make sure we understand your workflow and have it properly configured in the system. And then we'll have a series of, whether it's on-site or virtual trainings, we can do whatever works best for the team, we'll have a series of those trainings throughout the next, really the next 30 days is the ideal. But to make sure that the key members on the team are trained as super users. And that's going to be critical also, because at the same time that you want to keep the operations efficient and make sure that you're not creating bottlenecks by only having 1 or 2 people administer data in the software, you also don't want the entire team to be accessing, and then you have too many fingers in the soup. So you want to train a couple of key people on how to use the platform, and then that's really the implementation process. And then through that, you'll have team members assigned to kind of manage your operation with you, and as your operation grows and proceeds, kind of handling any questions or any one-offs that come up.
Fantastic. Rafael, thank you. There are some questions that have come in, and we'll address those with Bob at the end of his presentation. So with that, now we've focused on the value proposition of hemp, farming, the agricultural side of it. We focused on the ancillary support around compliance. And now we're going to focus on the international trade, commerce, and economics that surround the opportunities of cannabis within Ecuador. And with that, we have Bob Hoban, who sits at the center of the world's largest commercial cannabis industry network. It's an ecosystem that he has painstakingly cultivated since 2008. And since the cannabis industry has become commercialized, he's been widely credited for creating a class of lawyers now called cannabis attorneys. In addition, he's the founder and chairman of Hoban Law Group, the largest cannabis firm in the world. And he's also founded GPS, the company that I work for as well. He's consistently been recognized as the most influential people in the global cannabis industry by a variety of organizations and publications over the past 10 years. And Bob is frequently in the media as a legal expert on cannabis and has been a keynote speaker at dozens of cannabis events around the world, and is currently the content expert and host of his own podcast called The Hoban Minute, a weekly podcast series touching on current events and his perception of them. So Bob, welcome, thank you, and we look forward to your presentation. And if you could just signal to us when to move your slide along, that would be fantastic.
Perfect. Thank you, Ceci, and everyone for participating today. This event thus far has been really informative, even for someone that hears this information on a regular basis. It's always good to get updated, and the cast of panelists and presenters has been fantastic. So thanks to GPS for putting this on, and of course our good friends and hosts in Ecuador. So I want to save some time at the end of this as it relates to questions, because I presume people will have a lot of questions. For the first 25 to 35 minutes, I'll run through these slides and talk, as Ceci noted, about the international commerce perspective. So we've heard a lot about the technical elements of what you do and what you can do with this plan, how to cultivate, how to maximize yield, how to position yourselves so you can participate. Some of those themes will come back during this presentation against the backdrop of the global cannabis economy. And that is one thing I want to stress before we dive into the slides here, is that context matters. Context, for example, where you fit in the global cannabis supply chain means a lot. And it's a question you have to ask yourself from the very beginning. I've seen far too many folks in far too many places around the world go out and get their licensure in their particular country or jurisdiction. And it's a really, really hard process to get that license, to build out the infrastructure, to get the genetics, to find the right partners, employees, and farmland. All of those things are extremely difficult. But if you do those things and you focus on those specific details without understanding the bigger picture, where you fit in the global cannabis supply chain, then you're missing that critical component, which is essential for success, and that is context. What do I mean by context? I mean, for example, if your country, in Ecuador, for example, allows licensure from an ag-based perspective to cultivate industrial hemp. Understand what kind of genetics you're going to put into the ground, understand what products those genetics will most optimally yield, and understand where those materials and products can go. If you don't understand all of those pieces from an international perspective, then you're missing out on the real opportunity, which is to cement yourself in what is an emerging global supply chain. And when we look at a supply chain, of course, we talk about genetics on one end. What is it that the farmer is going to plant? How stable are those genetics? What are the characteristics of the yield for those genetics? What do those genetics do best? And when you think about genetics, you oftentimes think about cannabinoid priorities, meaning high CBD content. And that is certainly a goal for many farmers around the world. But what I'm trying to suggest is that we've got a plant that can do so many different things here. So understand from genetics to where is it going to get processed, where's the material going to get processed, and then where is the material going to be packaged or transformed so that it can be useful as a protein, as a food, as an oil, so forth and so on. So Eric, if you could take that one slide back, I want to start with the notion of the backbone. And what do I mean by hemp is and will continue to be the backbone of the global cannabis supply chain? If you look at the hemp plant with well over 50,000 uses, there really is no need for the global cannabis supply chain to plant high quantities of high THC marijuana varieties unless it's being used for flower. What I mean by that is, if I take 1 acre of industrial hemp and I take off seeds and I take fiber and I truly use all parts of what some have referred to as the green buffalo, then I can satisfy every need within the global cannabis supply chain from one plant, including those wellness and medicinal uses. Think about that for a moment. Even though the plant material contains below 0.3% THC or below 1% THC in certain jurisdictions, such as this jurisdiction, the aggregation, the collection of all of that THC from 1 acre, let alone from 100 acres or hectares, would yield a significant quantity of even the medicinally beneficial cannabinoids, including but not limited to CBD, THC, and beyond. So if we could go to the next slide, please. We look at the fact that this one plant can service multiple verticals. Sometimes we think that the cannabis plant can help us, as farmers or as processors, create success, financial success very, very quickly. Too many people have focused in on one of those sectors, whether that be the medical applications or the nutritional supplement applications of this plant and of the cannabinoids, instead of focusing on the fact that the plant can do so many other things. And there's been a lot of discussion about that here this morning. And I want to highlight that point, that if you're looking at the plant for one single purpose, you're probably going to limit your ability for long-term success. You might be able to produce cannabinoids at a high rate initially for nutritional supplement or medical use, but ultimately that market in your country will be saturated, not when or if, but when it will become saturated. The global cannabis marketplace is largely saturated. This is coupled with the fact that it doesn't take a lot of plant material to produce significant quantities of cannabinoid products. For example, some of the largest CBD retailers and distributors in the world only grow about 100 to 150 acres of their own plant material, and that satisfies their entire need from a global supply perspective. My point is, it just doesn't take that much plant material to produce cannabinoids. But if you have an abundance of plant material, you can service paper products, plastics, and ultimately where I see things going in a major way, the oil and the fuel supply component of the plant. Next slide, please. I come back to the notion that this is in fact the backbone, and you've heard a lot about it. The plant itself can supply grain. So we're looking at a food that's high in proteins, high in omega-3s and omega-6s that can be used for human consumption and has been approved by local authorities and federal authorities all over the world through the FDA equivalents for grain production. What we need to see is that the abundance of grain being produced so that the cost per unit is the equivalent of other grain products for it to be competitive in the marketplace. And hemp grain, hemp seed is a finicky thing in that the purchasers want to ensure that it tastes properly and that the taste is consistent from crop to crop to crop. So it is a bit of a difficult area, but it's an easy area to participate from a farming perspective. Think about the fiber components, short fibers for industrial uses. What we've seen is automobiles around the world using hemp fiber for their door paneling because it eliminates the noise, the sound within the passenger compartment. There are a number of other short fiber uses, not the least of which would be for protective military type equipment and military type textile production. And then long fibers for typical consumer production. And long fibers in that respect are the key. Look at the keef, as it's known in certain circles. Keef would be the trichomes, the crystals that come off of the plant that contain the cannabinoids, the terpenes, the flavonoids, other components of the plant that have value. One thing that a lot of people don't know is that the terpenes in and of themselves are probably the most valuable part of the plant today by weight, because of the fact that terpenes are used in different sectors around the world for flavor and taste, and terpenes happen to be terpenes. Terpenes exist across the plant biosphere as it relates to different plant materials, and terpenes from the hemp plant are particularly useful and sought after in a global cannabis industry. Look at the cellulose, the lignin, and the sugar, parts of the plant that are oftentimes overlooked from a paper and plastic building block perspective, from a perspective of using the sugar as an alternative sweetener or the basis for the creation and distillation of various spirits and alcohol. The parts of the plant that nobody talks about are the ones that I would encourage you to take a long look at, because those building blocks, the cellulose, the lignin, the sugars, those parts of the plant do form the basis for large-scale industrial commodities such as plastics, such as fuels, and something that we talk about oftentimes but few understand, something called graphene, which is a supercapacitor. It conducts electricity, and the properties that come from the graphene derived from the hemp plant have greater qualities than other naturally derived graphene substances. So there's great promise there as well. And then THC, as I mentioned, you get 10 to 12 metric tons of biomass per acre, depending on the style in which you plant. If you're planting traditional multi-purpose industrial hemp plants, you're probably going to see 12 or 13 metric tons per acre of biomass. And if 0.3%, let alone 1% of that biomass is THC, then that's a substantial amount of THC that can be used for commercial purposes once regulations are enacted country by country. But that product is moving even today when it's isolated and sold into the medical complex for research, development, and drug processes. Now, all of these things, grain, fiber, keef, so on and so forth, these require infrastructure. This is the most difficult part of the growth of the industrial hemp industry in the United States. In the US, we saw a large focus on CBD, which meant the infrastructure was harvest equipment, and extraction or labs, meaning let's take the cannabinoids out of the plant material that we harvest, concentrate them, create formulas, and put that out into the wholesale or retail marketplace. Now that's the easy part of the infrastructure required to process industrial hemp. The difficult part, which is really long-standing technology, but difficult because it requires a lot of infrastructure development closest to the farmers would be seed conditioning, seed drying, looking at fiber separation. In other words, what's called decortication. Decortication that's done to preserve long fibers is perhaps one of the most rare, widespread technologies right now to process the hemp plant, even though it's very basic technology that's been around for a long time. Separation and preservation of the keef and separation, taking that keef and separating the cannabinoids, the terpenes, so forth and so on through various chemical processes goes back to the laboratory. How do you remove the cellulose, the lignin, and or the sugars from the plant? We've seen something called counter-current technology, and that's been used on a large scale with a variety of plants around the globe to concentrate and remove those components of the plant. So that infrastructure is a place where Ecuador can focus and perhaps even become a regional leader by putting in broad-based infrastructure, not just focusing on extraction and laboratories for the refinement of extracted materials. If you focus just on those are needed parts of the process, but if you focus just on those parts of extraction and the laboratory refinement process, you're missing out on what makes this a broad-based ag product, and that is not good for the farmers if you miss these other parts of the plant. We saw in the United States the production of hemp ramp up in about 5 years from 0 acres to 500,000 plus registered acres in the United States. That doesn't mean 500,000 acres were planted, but it does mean that they were registered. We probably saw about half of that planted. Half of that was planted in 2019 resulted in a lot of biomass that was intended to be extracted for CBD, CBG, and other forms of genetics that highlighted certain concentrated levels of cannabinoids. Well, a lot of that plant material didn't sell. And here's why it didn't sell. Because of the fact that there are no crystal clear regulations anywhere in the world. Let me state that again. There are no crystal clear regulations anywhere in the world as it relates to cannabinoids and their use as medicine, supplements, or what I'd call a functional food product. We're getting there. We're starting to see, particularly in South America, we're starting to see nationalized healthcare systems begin to embrace the use of these cannabinoids for medicinal purposes, but we're simply not there. And without regulations that are global and uniform, what does that mean? That means there are less outlets for me to sell the product, whether it's a finished good that, for example, ends up in a tincture bottle or ends up in a cream. There are less outlets to sell those products without uniform regulation around the world. And just 2 other notes on that, because this is important. The European Union had been seen over the last 2 to 4 years as the place to go to distribute this material. And you still can distribute cannabinoid products in the European Union. However, the EU, the government that ties together multiple members of the European Union, has effectively reconsidered its path to looking at cannabinoids, CBD in particular, as what's called a novel food or a new food ingredient. And it's shifted its focus more towards a narcotic, a drug-like treatment. This will present major problems for the continued distribution on a wide scale across the EU. The United States has looked at these things as well. And when you look at the global supply chain development, you do have to know where you fit. So you have to understand where this product's going to go. You can't simply say, we know there's a lot of consumers in North America, or there's a lot of consumers in the European Union. You have to get more specific. Next slide, please. So what are some of the global opportunities? Canada regulates cannabis by use. It makes little distinction from its consumer product perspective between hemp and marijuana. Cannabinoids derived from cannabis are run through a process that is onerous, that is costly in terms of compliance and registration, and it distributes that. There's not a ton of consumers in Canada that buy these products presently, because it is relatively new, and we're looking at a country with approximately 40 million people. So if you look at the United States, we've got two systems. We've got a marijuana, or what people call as the cannabis regulated system, above 0.3% THC, and hemp below 0.3% THC. Hemp is far less regulated from a cultivation and processing standpoint, but accordingly, because of the lack of regulation, there's not as many distribution outlets. We've got online e-commerce. We have brick and mortar stores that put topicals in place, but without crystal clear opportunity and regulation, we're going to have to operate in this very light gray area. It doesn't mean the products are illegal, but it does mean that they're not yet regulated. So to import them into the United States is even a challenge for that very reason. Now, I look at Latin America as a whole as having a tremendous opportunity to participate, and that is a major focus for why we wanted to bring this seminar with our partners into Ecuador. The great opportunity is that we see nationalized healthcare systems such as Anvisa in Brazil, such as the regulatory authorities in Mexico, and the Mexico legislation will be enacted by the end of 2020. If we look at Mexico and Brazil, and we look at Colombia, there's well over 400 million people in those three countries alone. And what's unique about those three countries is that they do provide for domestic distribution. I would suggest that a path that focuses on export only is not a sustainable enterprise, because there are 90% of the world's countries, and there are many countries producing cannabis, 90% of them have an export-only model. And that export-only model is challenging if you focus on cannabinoids only. But if you look at the plant as a whole, as we've heard this morning, and as we've talked about briefly here in this presentation, there are further opportunities for Ecuador to participate in an environment that uses all parts of the plant, including, but not simply limited to, cannabinoid or CBD production. We saw Paraguay come out with recent legislation. Peru is moving very, very quickly. Costa Rica has embraced this notion as an extract for oils and for cannabinoid production. We've seen the Caribbean region and various islands within the Caribbean look at legislation. But as I mentioned, a lot of these models are export only. So the fact that domestic distribution can be a driver for at least some parts of what comes out of the hemp plant within Ecuador is very, very important. And that's what presents a tremendous opportunity for this plant. Next slide, please. So the new paradigm, as I would call it, and this is what I want to stress, and I think most of the speakers here were trying to stress. If you focus strictly on cannabinoid production, you might create a viable business. You might even succeed financially for a couple of years. But that global market is so saturated that I would strongly encourage you, and I think that's the tone of most of the presenters here today, to talk about the entire plant use. As I mentioned, when you use the plant, you get about 8 to 12 metric tons of biomass per acre, depending on the style in which you plant. To get 12 metric tons of biomass per acre, the input costs are far less, in fact, a small fraction of what you would pay to simply produce cannabinoid related, what I'd call horticultural style planting versus agricultural style planting. If you plant that plant with the ability to produce grain, you can yield approximately 700 pounds of grain per acre. You can yield 5,000 plus pounds of straw per acre. In other words, the material within the plant that can be further processed for the separation of the fiber and the hurd. And that's one thing that we haven't talked about, and that is that hurd use. Think about the hurd uses from a building materials perspective. We're seeing hemp homes, hemp garages, hemp infrastructure being built all around the world, literally on nearly every continent, at least 4 or 5 of the continents, by using hurd as the building block for this material. And that does create a supply chain. Now, plant material that's not high in value is difficult to ship around the world, but with that value add of creating a finished good, animal bedding, door paneling, creating extracts that are high in protein and omega-3s and 6s for the processing and feeding of the animal food supply chain, the shrimp industry. These are things that then in turn create a commodity. And if you have something identified as a commodity, what does that mean? It means that people are trading in that material, that product, before it comes out of the ground. So if I'm a farmer and I plant 100 acres of a commodity, I'm planting 100 acres because I have contracts on the other side to sell the 100 acres of material, and processors downstream will be processing that material before, and the commitments are made before that plant ever goes in the ground, certainly before it ever comes out of the ground. That enables you to get crop insurance on a large scale, and that varies by country in terms of what the ability is. We talked about genetics. There's the difference between certified seeds under OECD or ASCA standards that are international governing standards for agricultural seed certification. And then we've seen feminized seeds, which is an interesting component when you think about registering seeds within Ecuador up to that 1%. It creates a lot of flexibility. But I would present one question to think about just for a moment. If in fact I produce a 1% hemp plant, and I take cannabinoids, CBD, let's call it, out of the plant, and I try to bring that CBD into the United States, is that CBD lawful in the United States? It came from a plant that had more than 0.3% THC. So therefore, under US law, it would be treated as a marijuana extract, not. There are some challenges producing cannabinoids with 1% plants in terms of legality for international commerce that have yet to play out, but I want to put those in your mind to think about how you characterize that, process that, and position that for international commerce. I'd look at grain and fiber as the way to break even, then cannabinoids. Now, as I look at technologies that move this plant forward, we look at harvesters like the multi-combine in the picture in front of you. That's one of the most advanced harvesters in the world, produced in Germany by Hemp Farms and Rafael Dulan in particular. It's extremely novel technology using a header that is able to process the field multiple times to take the top 3 feet, the next 4 feet, and then the roots and the remainder of the plant for different uses throughout the cultivation and harvesting process. I'd look at drone technology, as I highlight on the left of this image, where drones are used to not only apply and plant, but to gather data from the field. Data from the field looks like that image that you see with the pink and blue shading, where every single plant in that field is accounted for. Every single plant. It has the ability to tell you which plants are male, which plants are female, so that when you send out a crew to rogue the fields, that you can specifically precision pinpoint the areas you need to go. And it also deals with performance and underperformance. We talked about genetics, making sure that genetics get into a testing process for certification, and that global agricultural standards and agency registrations are so critical that I would take a close look at certified varieties under international standards that exist already versus creating new varieties for some of the challenges that I mentioned before. And when you talk about cross-border transactions, think about customs. What does customs treat the plant as? For example, a 1% plant CBD extract into the United States, even if it's lawful CBD, could be treated by customs as marijuana versus hemp because of the 1% or being above 0.3%. And many countries follow that rule. The European Union's at 2% in a backdoor way. Look at the phytosanitary standards that are required and the approvals to get plant material out of the country, seed material in and out of the country as well. Understand those processes, interact with the agencies that are required to oversee that, and look at the certifications and the registrations for those transactions. The higher certification from health and safety and consumer protection standpoint, and the higher certification for the plant material and the processing facilities, the more likely that that plant material, however it's ultimately processed and delivered, will be available to sell in international commerce across the globe. Next slide, please. So look at some of the strategies. I would suggest that operating within Ecuador is a great place to start, obviously, but how can you expand internationally? If you're producing material here and you do something very well, then there will be an opportunity in Brazil, in Uruguay, in some of your neighboring countries to expand into processing and ultimately into different verticals that flow from the plant. Look at different investment strategies. The wisdom for the past several years was to invest in extraction almost exclusively. That framework has largely failed across North America, although there still is a need for processing and extraction expertise and technology across the Latin American region. Now, if we look at capital raise strategies and trends, there is a major focus from funds, from capital groups, towards looking at broader uses of the hemp plant beyond cannabinoids and CBD. And that's where some of that infrastructure to support grain, fiber processing, cultivation, and that countercurrent technology, keep an eye out for that, because countercurrent technology is a game changer for the industrial hemp process around the globe. Merger and acquisition trends and strategies for different companies. If you get a license in Ecuador, can you align with processors in other neighboring countries? Can you align with suppliers and distributors in the European Union and North America? Those things are critical, particularly to get on the radar of a merger and acquisition fund or merger and acquisition outfit that's looking to aggregate various pieces of that supply chain. And I encourage you to look at this through that lens of being a supply chain. Next slide, please. So I talked a little bit about this. The whole world's watching what happens with novel foods and the narcotics designation in the European Union, because that's where there's 500 million plus consumers that will ultimately purchase this material and have demonstrated that they will purchase this material on a large scale. So at the end of the day, what we've seen is those materials go towards and go through that vetting process. And the whole world's also watching what our FDA in the United States does. Although it may be ill-equipped to regulate this plant based on what it knows right now, it is out there seeking information, seeking data, seeking samples for safety and toxicity studies, and ultimately determining how it wants to regulate the consumables coming off of the plant that contain high levels of cannabinoids. So there are a number of legal and regulatory challenges around the globe that I would highlight that will limit your ability to do business in an ordinary fashion, but with the right expertise and the right navigation through this environment, there is an ability to create contracts and offtake agreements for that. I believe we're coming to the end here, so next slide, Eric, please. So ultimately at the Q&A portion, I covered a lot of ground in a really, really short period of time, but that was just to describe to you the complexities. And the one word I want you to take away from all of this is context. Understand where you fit in that global cannabis supply chain, despite the fact that getting an operation up and running in one location is hard enough. You have to understand that context, or else you have no hope of succeeding. I don't want to say that pessimistically. I want to say that objectively and realistically, because if you don't know what your potential buyers look like and you haven't reached out to them, there is very little chance of surviving in this extremely competitive environment.
So Bob, thank you so much. That was fantastic. And your words to our ears, it's almost like following the dollar. If those that are interested in getting into the marketplace don't really understand how their product will be commercialized at the end, it will be a challenge for them to understand how to raise the right capital or raise capital and apply it to the right infrastructure. Is that correct?
It is, and that's the whole thing too, right? Is you also want to find smart capital, because if capital's coming at you with a focus on what might have happened yesterday versus what's going to happen tomorrow in this industry, then it might not be the right partner for you, because capital wants to follow the dollar. And if the capital doesn't understand that following the dollar means a broader application, a broader perspective of what this plan can do, then there will be challenges with that capital partner for sure.
Well, thank you. And at this stage of the educational forum, I'd like to bring Rafael back on as we have about 10 minutes for Q&A. And as Rafael's coming on, Bob, there was a question that was directed to you early on in your presentation. And it states, if you were an Ecuadorian decision maker whom is pushing for a legislative chance and promoting this new industry as a national priority, which verticals or niches would you choose to generate quick gains and a sustainable exportable offer as part of development-oriented policy?
That's a thick question. I have to break it up into pieces. Where I would go for a quick gain is ultimately, if you can put infrastructure in place surrounding farmers in your particular region, you will be busy for the foreseeable future. And when I say infrastructure, I mean not just extraction, beyond extraction. That is something that is easily adaptable. But if you do that, then you can sustain business going forward. If you look at all of the different ways that one plant can be used, I would start to contact the grain suppliers, the grain companies. I would look at fiber partners for industrial uses. I would start with those uses before I started to think about cannabinoid uses. Although if you are going to be a cannabinoid producer, then you should partner with somebody that already has material, know-how, and expertise, so that you can introduce the material that you will produce, and I stress will produce, to the same specs that's already being produced, to register and introduce that into various systems like the Brazilian system, which is available right now.
Thank you, Bob. Rafael, I had two questions that came in, so I'm going to pose both of them to you and for you to answer. And first is, how do you comply with the EU GMP in GMP? And the second is, how much is the cost of a basic plan?
Thank you. So with the GMP, what we do there is we have all of the software allows you to collect all the data elements and generate the reporting throughout your workflow to demonstrate that you're following the correct protocols. But ultimately, we also, if for the super users, as I like to call them, if you'd like, we do partner with a couple of platforms. Isolocity is one of them. There's a few other names that I'm forgetting, but what those do, those kind of fit into the last bucket of technology that I mentioned, which is the ERP plugins or the ancillary tools that work within the ecosystem. So some of those tools, like I think Isolocity actually works outside of cannabis as well. But we'll have, long story short, we have all of the data elements and reporting internally within MJ Freeway's platform to help with that. And then ultimately, if you want a platform that digitizes and automates a lot of that for you, we integrate directly with some of those like Isolocity. And then I hope I answered that correctly. If not, please kind of ask me for more detail. But with in terms of the pricing, so that definitely it kind of changes a little bit depending on the market. But for the most part, the average that you'd expect is between $500 and $600 per location. That can go up or down depending on kind of the packages that you guys need and all that. But that's, if you kind of want a Coca-Cola index, as I like to say, that's kind of the best one for you.
Great, thank you.
Sure.
Bob, this isn't a question that has come in, but it would be wonderful to hear your comments based on your expertise on how hemp might be able to be used as a protein grain and a substitute for some of the other grains that we're seeing out of Ecuador. In addition to, do you have any comment on the exporting of roses, the large infrastructure of exportation of roses, and how hemp may be able to help with that marketplace as well?
Great question, Ceci. I'd start with the protein and the grain side of things. We've seen considerable increase in the demand for hemp-derived proteins, or frankly, broader than that, plant-based proteins around the world. That actually has been heightened by our coronavirus COVID-19 scenario globally, where we see food supply chains that have been impacted because of more difficulty of importing and exporting materials. So there are, in fact, protein deficiencies that exist around the world, country by country, but that's been exacerbated by the COVID-19 scenario. So we're starting to see an increase in grain sales. Now, the problem is what I mentioned earlier, and this is a problem when you think about it. When you think about buying a kilogram of another form of grain that might have high levels of protein and other nutritional benefits, that grain would be less costly than that same kilogram of hemp grain right now, because there is not an abundance of supply and standardization of that supply. But with the increased demand, it is a place to go. There are grain brokers all around the world that are increasingly looking at hemp as a viable alternative to fill that food supply chain need. And so that's where I would go, is I would look at grain pricing. I would look at what it would take to get grain pricing from hemp grain into the realm that's comparable with other grains that service that. But I'd also look at the animal food, the food supply chain as it relates to animals. There are studies. The European Union has fed their animals industrial hemp-derived proteins, grain, for a long, long time. There's studies to back that up. And even though there are not appreciable amounts of cannabinoids in that, we've seen that those animals tend to be healthier. Those studies have moved into the United States through various universities, and ultimately that will validate that. As I understand, the shrimp industry in Ecuador is extremely prominent, meaning there was a need for protein or protein cakes, which, by the way, is effectively a waste product from the hemp plant that shrimp can be fed. So think about all of the different waste streams from milling and extraction that also the hemp can be used for different things, and animal feeds and proteins from that are one of those. As it relates to the rose industry and the exportation of flowers and how this creates an opportunity, at least it provides a standard for how plant material, hemp flowers, can be exported, for example. We've seen other countries in the region initially say no exports of plant material, no exports of hemp flowers, for example, when there is a demand for hemp flower for a variety of reasons around the world. So we shouldn't limit farmers, and to have a robust plant industry that focuses on flowering plants and have that import, export, and phytosanitary process defined, and simply put hemp into that process is an advantage, I believe, as well, for Ecuador to participate in that hemp biomaterial, biomass exportation process.
Thank you, Bob. Rafael, a question just came in for you. Do you have a mobile tool included in the price of your work in order to work remotely without internet?
So I'm glad you asked that. So the platform is actually cloud-based, and with that, we host based off of Amazon AWS. So we have kind of all the security and redundancy that you need for that. But being cloud-based, as long as if you with the base platform without needing any kind of additional tool, if you have access to Wi-Fi, so even if it's not signal, if you have a hotspot, I understand some of you guys might be out there in the field or in the mountains not have that, but if you have a hotspot, you'll be able to access no problem. There's certain functions that you can do in the software still, and then batch upload when you get back into internet or data signal. But we are excitedly actually, so it's not too public yet, but we're launching a mobile version, a mobile app that interfaces with the platform. So it's just for that. So that's going to be launched within the next realistically 8 to 12 weeks. But what that will provide is exactly, I think, what you guys are requesting, where it's specifically for in instances where you're just not going to have data, there's no hotspot, you can be out there in the field tending to the plants, and as it's on an app, right? So as soon as that you get back into Signal, it'll batch upload and report back to the same reporting database. So long way to say yes. We do have those functionalities. And then one even advanced app is coming out within the next few weeks here.
Fantastic. Thank you, Rafael. Now, Bob, this is a question that I think you can answer just based on your comments around extraction. And if not, then maybe Ryan may have a comment if he is still here as well. What extraction technologies are being used in Latin America markets, such as Uruguay and Colombia, if any? What could be some pros and cons of each technology within Ecuador using, and for example, ethanol, CO2, hydrocarbon?
Well, I do want to ask Ryan or Rafael to weigh in on this. I'll give you my 2 cents worth. Most of the extraction that historically has been done surrounding the extract of materials from plants has been from the ethanol-based category. We've worked with a number of nutraceutical processors that extract everything from every form of plant that they could find around the world, and ethanol has always been their preferred way to do it. With CO2 technology, perhaps it's more efficient, it's perhaps more costly. I've seen some of the larger Canadian companies go into different regions in Latin America and initially invest in small extraction labs to test material, to test the output, and then they've very quickly gone towards building out large-scale supercritical CO2 facilities. So I don't know if there's a preference in the marketplace, and that's why I'd ask Ryan, but at the end of the day, ethanol extraction is what I see as really being the backbone for the botanical extract industry, although hemp and cannabis have put a spin on that, definitely. Ryan, what do you think?
So thanks, Bob. No, I've got to claim ignorance on this one. Really, my expertise ends with cultivation. So I know very little about the extraction process, unfortunately.
Rafael, do you have anything to add on that? Because like I said, my only experience to date has been folks come in and they build small scale ethanol to begin with. Instead of expanding that, they tend to go, once they've got the funding in place, towards something that's a larger scale CO2. From a certification standpoint, have you seen the prevalence of one more than the other?
Well, just out of my personal experience, and I wouldn't equate that as necessarily a best practice in and of itself. And this is coming from a lot of focus with, I guess, Puerto Rico would be the most applicable market that I'm referring to, but comes from a lot of experience with Puerto Rico, Illinois, Colorado, many states throughout. Supercritical CO2 is what I've encountered the majority of. I definitely see ethanol out there as well as some other methods. But that for me is coming more from the software guy's perspective, right? So in helping manufacturers kind of set up their processes within the software. So that's where my I guess where I start and stop. So with that, I've seen a lot of CO2 extraction, as I mentioned. I've seen some ethanol as well, but mostly CO2. But that may be just more particular to some of the demographics and markets that I've been working in. Ceci, sorry, I see you speaking, but you're there you go.
Thank you, Rafael.
Sure.
And at this point, I want to thank all of our panelists to this point in our educational forum, starting with Eric Singular, talking about the opportunities with hemp as an agricultural commodity, Ryan as it relates to farming and the nuances around farming, Rafael with the supplemental compliance opportunities that are necessary, I shouldn't say opportunities, but are necessary and probably will be just as necessary in Ecuador. And Bob, as always, your insight into the industry as well as the way to make money from it internationally and domestically, what was a wonderful overview. So again, I want to thank each and every one of you for this. What I'd also like to do before I turn it over to our hosts is just mention there's quite a few questions here that were not answered per se. We will get back to you via email. with chock full of information. Some people have requested the slides, so we'll ask the speakers if some of the slides can be forwarded along. We'll answer some of the questions, and we'll also provide information about the different sponsors, such as Ryan Douglas Cultivation, such as Akerna, MJ Freeway, Gateway Proven Strategies, as well as the Hoban Law Group. So we will forward that. And again, we just want to take a moment to thank our partners with Javier and Jose, and with all of the great work they've done to put this program on for us. And with that, we'd like to turn the last 10 minutes over to Javier and Jose to talk about next steps as it relates to how they see what's happening from a legislative perspective, and how they will continue to support these educational efforts that we enjoy doing, and hopefully can help you exceed your dreams as it relates to hemp. So with that, Jose, I notice you're on mute, and Javier's on mute as well. So thank you, gentlemen.
Ceci, can I just say one thing before we turn it over? I just want to congratulate Javier and Jose, our good friends and partners. And you don't have conversations like this unless people go out there and work really, really hard and get the right participants and really open people's eyes from a public policy standpoint. And those guys on the ground working with several folks have really made all of this happen. And you know, my hat's off to you guys for working so hard and the success you've had. And I'm real proud to be working with y'all on this stuff. So thank you for that.
Hi guys, I just want to take a couple of minutes to thank you all, Robert, Ceci, Rafael, Ryan, Eric, Diana. Thank you so much for making the time to this conversation. As Robert said, it's not easy to get this kind of panel to talk about cannabis. A nuestros amigos que nos están viendo acá en Ecuador, pues recoger de todo este webinar que hemos tenido, pues la importancia de entrar a la industria de manera responsable. Es normal sentirnos muy ansiosos a la espera de la normativa, estar muy ansiosos por empezar a sembrar y hacer pruebas, pero debemos ingresar de manera responsable y tranquila a la industria si es que queremos que prospere en el Ecuador, ¿no? Es muy importante tener espacios como este para poder discutir acerca de la planta. Es principalmente lo que tratamos de hacer de Ecuacáñamo, y apreciamos mucho el apoyo que nos da GPS, Hoban Law Group, Praetorium, Akerna, Ryan Douglas Cultivation. Es muy importante que existan espacios como estos. Básicamente agradecerles, y me gustaría darle paso a Javier Valverde para que nos haga un poco el closure del webinar y nos cuente lo que estamos esperando y lo que se viene ahora con la normativa en Ecuador. Muchas gracias a todos. Thank you so much.
Muy buenos días con todos. Quiero felicitar a todos los expositores que hemos tenido el día de hoy. Ha sido impresionante la información que nos han podido otorgar, y sobre todo el buen direccionamiento y el adecuado direccionamiento al cual debemos seguir. Y ahorita lo que nos toca a nosotros poder dar paso es respecto a el proceso que está viviendo el Ecuador. Específicamente ahorita estamos en una pausa esperando que se debe emitir la normativa secundaria por parte del Ministerio de Agricultura. Y es sumamente importante este aspecto, y es lo que nos va a poder brindar cierta seguridad jurídica. Porque se debe tomar en cuenta que la norma que se encuentra elaborando el Ministerio de Agricultura debe ser una norma de introducción de la industria canábica al Ecuador. Y por lo tanto debemos estar muy vigilantes respecto a las oportunidades que ofrezca la misma para los inversores y demás sectores estratégicos. En esta línea es recomendable que el Ministerio elabore una norma que permita tener un acceso diligente, que no obstaculice la gestión y los beneficios de la cadena de producción, tomando como ejemplo los países que aún tienen ciertas limitaciones devenida de la presión social, marcos regulatorios extremadamente restrictivos o tabúes originados por la desconfianza o desconocimiento de la planta. Debe ser una norma que permita una simple regularización, pero con un extremo control. El ingreso adecuado a esta industria genera grandes expectativas a los ecuatorianos, pero no solamente a estos, sino a todos los actores de la industria. Es más, están conscientes que históricamente el Ecuador ha demostrado su capacidad de generar productos con sus propias características y de extraordinaria calidad. Y es así que hemos tenido una marca sectorial del país con el mejor camarón del mundo. distinguiéndose del resto. Inclusive tenemos la única tilapia de producción a nivel mundial sin hormonas y sin antibióticos. Es que es indiscutible que las condiciones ecosistémicas de nuestro país son las más adecuadas y propicias para catalogarnos como una potencia en la agroindustria. Por ello, y en base a estos antecedentes, visionamos grandes expectativas para el país. Pero hay que estar también conscientes que de nada sirve hacer significativas inversiones si no conocemos realmente quiénes son las personas o cuáles son los grupos de empresas que van a demandar nuestro producto que pretendemos emprender. Y asimismo, qué características son. Por lo tanto, debemos ser responsables que antes de hacer cualquier tipo de inversión hay que tener el contacto y la relación con quienes son los actores que van a demandar el producto que se pretende hoy en día incursionar en el país y poder introducirnos adecuadamente a la industria del cannabis. No me despido sin antes nuevamente agradecerle a todos los panelistas, a todas las personas que han tenido el interés de ser parte de este webinar, y prepárense porque estamos trabajando en un webinar para poder también hacer conocer la normativa que se viene, las oportunidades que se van a dar y sobre todo las seguridades jurídicas o los riesgos que se pretenden dar a través de estas normas secundarias. Muchas gracias por haber estado y haber participado. Saludos con todos.
This concludes the educational forum in hemp with a specific focus on Ecuador. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.